operations of the Working for Water, Working on Fire and Working for Land programs of the Government of South Africa's Department of Environmental Affairs. He's in charge of a whole lot of money, which is always important in this business. And he's been working as a natural resource manager in conservation agencies in South Africa, but also published extensively on the restoration of natural capital and on payments of ecosystem services. I have to inject, my first trip to South Africa was this summer, and I felt like a kid in a candy store. It was fantastic.
Thank you, Leon. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the odd one out this morning. I see I'm on the program and I've allowed Dolph to misrepresent me. I'm not a policy maker. My job is to turn policy and science into practice. And so my talk this morning is going to be somewhat different to the other policy people that you're going to hear today. And that's why you'll see I say turning both science and policy into practice, improving the quality and quantity of ecosystem services in South Africa by mainstreaming it into economic development. Now, I've had the privilege with four of us that are at this meeting, Laura, Mikkel, myself, and Marta were at a meeting in Italy last week, and there we engaged a little bit with business, so I threw in a little bit about what I've learned last week as well. I want to start off by being provocative, and I want to say biodiversity. This is the South African definition of biodiversity. So bloody what? We talk to one another about it. We all know how important it is, but no one else understands it. A colleague of mine, Richard Cowling, and a PhD student of his, did a survey in the Eastern Cape of local councillors last year. And they found that only 11% of 37 councillors that were interviewed actually could give a spontaneous, some sort of a definition of biodiversity. The person in the field out there, incidentally, the person in the picture is not a councillor, he's a traditional leader up in the Drakensberg. Of these only 11, only 14 provided a reasonable, correct definition of it. Now, if that's the level of awareness of biodiversity amongst decision makers, then we're either miscommunicating it, despite the brilliant talks that's been given, like Josh Farley has given yesterday or the day before, but it doesn't seem like we're getting through. I think the term is simply too complex for the decision makers. However, 95% of them was able to give some sort of definition for sustainability. So we've got something on them. We can start talking to them about sustainability. So it's going to be difficult. Initially, I was considering actually putting the little table with all the ecosystem services on it as one of my slides, and then I decided against it because I don't have all that much time. It's going to be very difficult to monetize all ecosystem services. So we need to identify those marketable services that are going to interest business in the first place, and secondly, that are going to interest governments. How can they mainstream it into their business or into the government priorities, or both? In some of the examples that I'm going to mention to you, both are interested in that. This does not mean, and I've left this slide specifically in, this does not mean that the other non-marketable services are less important than those, like cultural services, some of the cultural services. How do you sell your culture? How do you market your culture? That's prostitution. But that doesn't make it less important than the marketable services. So from last week's meeting, and Laura and Mikkel and Marta can disagree from me, but what I found out from last week's meeting is that business is interested in minimizing risk. If that means that they have to pay a community for some or other project, whether it's ecosystem services or not, if they have to pay a community for services to minimize their risk, they will do it. Secondly, they're interested in the in their competitive edge. They want to be better than the person next door or the company next door. It's therefore necessary to focus on how restoration and maintenance of ecosystem services can reduce business risk and improve their competitiveness. And we should start as natural resource managers. I'm talking to you as a natural resource manager, not as a policy maker. We as natural resource managers should start talking to business in that sense. So what are the kind of things that business are interested in? The water sector, for instance, in South Africa, we've developed these watershed services. I've tried to introduce into the National Water Resources Strategy as the upper end of the water value chain in South Africa. They're interested in floods. They're very concerned, the water engineers are very concerned about flooding and the impacts of floods. Low flows, if you lose your low flows in dry countries, maybe in other places in the world with much higher rainfall than South Africa, especially Holland, I'm afraid low flows might not be that important. But to us, it's incredibly important. Yield from infrastructure. Those are the kinds of things. What impacts does land management practices have on the yield from water infrastructure? And lastly, we've got this ecological reserve written into our Water Act, and business who are utilizing water is very, very much aware of that ecological reserve that needs to stay in the system. Secondly, a few weeks ago, James Blichloot and myself and some other natural resource managers and researchers were talking to the water resource planners in South Africa. And when we started talking about sediments, their ears went up. The siltation of infrastructure, and I'm going to highlight this in the next few slides. Lastly, water quality. What impact does land management practices have on water quality and the purification cost? Water weeds in South Africa is a big thing. And lastly, health risks, cholera outbreaks and those kind of things. So the water resource managers and industry are interested in that. Just to give you an idea of the siltation, these are the 5 biggest dams in South Africa. Now, the percentage sedimentation of those dams or reservoirs, the Americans call the wall dam and we call the whole thing a dam. 780 million cubic meters of storage space has gone in only these 4 or 5 mega dams in South Africa. There are, however, some dams. This picture, it's a Google Earth image of the first dam on the list. By the way, it's not 91% anymore. It's now 96%. This is a critical dam. They actually, this dam has been silted up by 96% and they're still extracting water from it. It costs you today in South Africa 20 rand, about $3, a cubic meter to build a cubic meter of storage space. To go and desal to dredge this dam is going to cost them 8 rand a cubic meter, just more than $1. So this is something real for water resource managers, for ESCOM, the water supply agency, etc., etc. Then the other marketable kind of things that we're working with, carbon offsetting. We've just been successful in getting our first forestation project, the Baviaanskloof, the people that attended the Baviaanskloof project the other night, session the other night. It's not in Baviaanskloof itself, it's in Addo National Park. We got our project design document accepted by the voluntary carbon standards. And then RED is a possibility. And lastly, something very real to South Africa is fire. The reduction of risk, business risk, as a result of wildfires. And I'm going to get back to this a little bit later on. Then, this is for government, for business. The next one is what's important to government. What's important to the decision makers in government. These are the 5 priority areas in the South African government. Health, education, crime, employment, and rural development. I've been threatening to do it for quite a while now, but our President gave his State of the Nation address in April. And I think the one word that's been used the most in that State of the Nation address was employment and jobs. It's incredible, and this applies to the whole of the African continent. South Africa's got an official unemployment rate of about 21%. The unions, the labor unions who are in bed with the central government, basically reckon it's 40% unemployment rate. So what we as natural resource managers then did, we mainstreamed ecosystem services, the Working For programs. That's where the names come from. Working for Water, it was all working for. And incidentally, very early on in our program, there was what we lightheartedly called or developed into the Costanza Bonanza. Bob, that work that we did in '95 actually contributed to what we are presenting to government now. And basically what we're focusing on is employment and rural development. And I'm going to go flip through a few maps with you just after I've done with this slide, just to show you how we can contribute to this. Then, lastly, for the government, what we've done with ecosystem services, or with watershed services at least, that subcomponent, both from a regulatory and a supply functions, we've mainstreamed it into the National Water Resources Strategy. The revised National Water Resources Strategy has not been accepted yet. But that little slide of mine with the watershed services listed is now listed in the National Water Resources Strategy. If we can do that, we've basically mainstreamed it into the Water Resource Management Program. What Costa Rica did was they mainstreamed it into the energy and the water sectors. And I still think that we can learn from Costa Rica. The rest of the world can learn from Costa Rica. So let's quickly run through a few maps. This is the high yield catchments, and just do me a favor, remember where those high yield catchments, where the water is coming from. This is sediment losses, where the high levels of sediment losses. Here in the western part of the country it's very dry, so you would expect higher sediment losses there. And then there's also an interesting area, if I could get this thing, maybe I'll... that's quite an important area as well. That's Lesotho. And then you get biodiversity. I always feel like one of these infomercials that when you lie awake, when you've got jet lag and you lie awake at 2 o'clock on a Monday morning or a Sunday morning and you switch the TV on and they say, you know, you get this thing for $9.99, but you still get biodiversity on top as well. This is, we still get it into biodiversity. We overlay it with biodiversity as well. And remember again this big blob there. Then where are the biggest needs for ecosystem services, for interventions with regards to ecosystem services in South Africa? This is a map of a very recently study that we completed of the extent of invasive alien plants in the country, impacting on water resources, impacting on fuel, on fire regimes, etc., etc. And you'll see the higher densities is in the eastern and southern parts of the country, impacting on water resources, impacting on productive potential of land, etc., etc. Secondly, this is a very high, the highly degraded parts of the country. And again, remember the high yield catchments, they're sitting here. That is our highest stressed catchment in the country. And this is the forgotten corner about South Africa. I wish I could get a lot of money to go and invest in there. And this is the fire regimes. This is the fire risk areas that the insurance industry would be interested in. Where are the highest risks of fire damage to infrastructure, etc., etc. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the poverty map of South Africa. And interestingly enough, if I flip back through these maps, they're lying on top of our poverty map and our rural development map. And this is the opportunity that the Working for Water programs have taken, or the Working For programs have taken in South Africa. But, again, we go to the infomercials. James has had this slide in his presentation yesterday. I don't know anything about these other guys. But James Blichnout and I did these three, these green ones. This is worth 24,000 full-time employment opportunities. Currently, we've got 35,000 people in our programs working every year. They don't work full-time. In fact, in the Working for Water program, the average person gets about 74 days of work per year. The Working on Fire program, on the other hand, gets about 250 working days of employment per year. But we're investing $260 million a year in these programs. In order to grow this market to where it should be, we need to go to 7.5 billion. The question is, how are we going to do it? And that's the big challenge for ecosystem services in South Africa. And this is what I would like to present to the ESP, or to the ecosystem service fraternity out there, what we need to focus on. We need to focus on improved primary ecological science assumptions. We need to do primary ecological research into the impact of land management practice, not just land management practice, management practices. There are marine colleagues here. We need to focus on that. Secondly, we need to translate these ecological assumptions into its economic consequences. Very often, the ecologists are asking their questions in a way, and they answer their questions in a way that we cannot translate it into its economic consequences, and we need to start focusing on that. Thirdly, one of the big things that I never thought I would ever become interested in is in the improved institutional arrangements and governance of ecosystem services. We need to regulate land use practices for the protection of quality and quantity for both in situ and ex situ ecosystem services, regulating the market for ecosystem services itself, and then developing legal tools or mechanisms for buyers and sellers to engage with one another. And lastly, what we also find is that we need to sell it to both the buyers and the sellers. There's only one representative of business in this room, if I am correct. He's sitting next to me as far as I know, and he's a spy introduced into the business fraternity. Then, ladies and gentlemen, a parting shot. I started off with biodiversity. I'm going to close off with biodiversity. Should we try and value biodiversity? Hell, man, if Farley and Costanza and all these guys couldn't have done it by now, who's going to be able to do it properly? Why don't we just use biodiversity as the foundation on which we build the ecosystem services market and start selling ecosystem services to the decision makers out there? Thank you very much.